What's the world gonna be in a year or two? What's it gonna be like for me and you?
I want to begin with a little quick graphic that will show you in I think a fairly stark way what has actually been happening to the climate of the Earth. What you'll see on this screen is all the countries of the world arrayed in alphabetical order. So Australia is about halfway along that first row. When I hit my button, it's going to start going from 1900 through to the present and then through to the future, showing what we call the temperature anomaly, which is the difference in the temperature in any one year and the average temperature over the whole period. You'll see that sometimes you'll see blue dots, which will mean a cooler year. Red and orange dots will mean a warmer year. And I think as we go through, what's happening will become pretty obvious. And if you'll excuse the pun, it'll take just a little while to warm up. So let's go. You keep your eye on that year up the top, you will see where we're at. So I think you'll get the message. In fact, 20 of the hottest years on record have been in the last 22 years. And we will keep going. So we have, of course, an international framework for action on climate change that was signed off and agreed in Paris in 2015. Here are the targets in that agreement. The aim of the agreement is to keep global temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an aspiration to keep temperatures below 1.5. The problem, of course, is that aspiration and reality can often be quite a distance apart, and we have currently a very large gap between ambition, policy and practice. Now, we've just heard from the Ambassador a very wonderful ambition. I'm very heartened by it, and some great policies. Of course, that all has to be put into practice. The EU, of course, is doing great things already. Not so great here in Australia, but I'll leave that for Richie to expand upon. I won't show you very many graphs in this talk, but I thought this was an important one. The red line there shows our current policy trajectory in terms of emissions, heading up to 3.5 degrees and beyond. Our current commitments under the Paris Agreement would get us still to 2 degrees or above, whereas what we really need to do is bend that curve down, not just flatten it, but bend it right down if we are to meet the agreement agreed in Paris. From a scientific perspective, how we try to estimate where we're at is using a technique called the carbon budget, which at its most simple basically relates how much carbon we're putting into the atmosphere to how hot it's getting. I'm going to show you the latest figures in how the carbon budget is showing us the level of ambition that we really need to have. So firstly, will we meet the 1.5 degree target? Well, our current greenhouse gas emission rates are putting about 11.5 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. At this rate, the amount of carbon in the budget that we can still spend will be fully spent in 2.5 years. To meet that 1.5 degree target under the Paris Agreement, we would have to ramp up what we are doing by 5-fold in terms of ambition and meet that ambition 100%. I think you probably don't need me to tell you that that is pretty unlikely. Will we meet the 2-degree target? Well, once again, if we assume emission rates of 11.5 gigatons of carbon, we will fully spend our global carbon budget in the next 9.5 years. Meeting that target would require a 3-fold increase in our pledges and once again, 100% implementation. So that means that to stay below 2 degrees, our emissions globally have to be halved by 2030. We must be at net zero by 2040. And the oft-stated goal of many businesses and countries and states of net zero by 2050 is actually too late to stay below 2 degrees. Well, so what? This is John Schellenhuber, a very famous German climate scientist. He visited Australia a few years ago and was asked this question. In fact, John Schellenhuber was the one that came up with the 2-degree target in the UNFCCC. He was asked, what's the difference between a 2-degree world and a 4-degree world? And this was his 2-word answer: human civilization. And this is where I want to link climate science to peace and security. The problem is, of course, is not average temperatures, it's extreme events. And as average temperatures climb, we are getting more of all of these sorts of events. And they're the ones that create the devastating impacts. And one of the best analogies I've heard about climate change and extreme events is it's like a minefield. As temperatures go up, the density of mines in that field increase. We can walk through that field and not step on a mine, but as the density of mines go up, our chances of stepping on a mine and having, a summer like last summer increase. Now, climate change is often viewed as an environmental problem, and indeed it is. Images like this kind of seem a long way away for us here in Australia. And I think as a communicator, what we need to really focus on is the fact that climate change is not just an environmental problem. It's a problem for our economy, our agriculture and food security, our health, and of course, people. And it's people that I want to focus on now. When we're thinking about global security, these are the sorts of images that most people have in mind. Fundamental Islamic terrorism, for example. But Barack Obama, during his presidency, gave speeches on 23 different occasions where he said that climate change was a greater threat to global security and peace than radical Islamic terrorism. What is security really? I want to boil it down to 3 axes of what we need. We need a safe and secure supply of water, of food, and a place to live. And climate change is affecting all of those 3 axes of security. Starting with water, here's some examples. Climate change is intensifying our water cycle. It's making wet places wetter and dry places drier. For example, up to 287 million people are at risk from coastal flooding as sea levels go up by 2100 under the high emissions scenario that we're currently experiencing. Some of the first environmental refugees that Australians will have to deal with will be our own citizens. These pictures are from Saibai Island in the Torres Strait. In the Torres Strait, sea levels are rising at about twice the global average, and these islands where a lot of people live are regularly inundated. That's just one example. But an even more important area of water security that will affect millions of people throughout the world is this. As our glaciers melt, we are losing water security. You can think of a glacier as a frozen dam. 1/6 of the world's population rely on water from seasonal snowmelt and glaciers. Here in the Andes, we've had 30 to 50% ice loss since the 70s, with the water supply and power supply of 80 million people threatened in the next few decades. Up in the Himalayan Hindu Kush region and the Tibetan Plateau, which is the source of 10 of Asia's major river systems, 500 glaciers have already disappeared, These glaciers supply water for about 20% of the world's population. This area has already warmed 1.5 degrees, and many of those glaciers, if not gone, are retreating fast. Then in dry parts of the world, drought is increasing, including here in Australia. So those red parts of that map indicate the most severe drought risk in the latter half of this century. And of course that affects food, as do many other things. I'll just show you one map now for food. This is showing the percentage change in crop yields by about 2050 due to temperature increase. And you can see here that Australia is certainly not immune from those challenges. And then finally, the people bit, the place to live. An Oxfam report last year said climate change was displacing 20 million people per year. And you can see that blue line on that graph shows the increase in climate-related disasters leading to people displacement going back to 2008. Weather-related disasters are actually 3 times more likely to cause displacement than other sorts of conflict. Just in the first half of last year, of the 10.8 million people displaced, 7 million were from so-called natural disasters that are really becoming not so natural anymore. And here are the most vulnerable people: the young, the old, the sick, people that work outside, especially in subsistence agriculture, and people that are already in challenging socioeconomic circumstances. And of course, all of these factors all interact. We're not dealing just with one. Each one is a threat multiplier for each other one. This is Sir Nicholas Stern. He wrote a very important report in 2006 on the economic impacts of climate change. And I think this is the most important part of that report. His statement is that climate change is the greatest market failure the world has seen. It's actually a statement about climate justice. And this map shows why. The red parts of the map on the top map show countries where CO2 emissions per capita are highest. The bottom map is the mirror image of the top one. It shows those that are most impacted by climate change. By comparing these two maps, you can see that those of us causing the most climate change will be least affected, and vice versa. That's what climate justice is all about. I want to end with this graph because we often talk about intergenerational equity, and it's another dimension of climate justice, peace and security. A friend of mine told me that every climate scientist has a favourite scary climate graph, and this is mine. It shows past, present and future climate change. The little wiggly black line is the climate change we've had so far. The blue bar is if we are successful at keeping our emissions low enough to stay below 2 degrees. The red band is unmitigated climate change, which is what we're heading to at the moment. To make this more than just a graph, I'm going to make it really personal. This is my lifespan if I live till I'm 85 at the average temperature that I will likely experience over that period. I have 2 children that were born in the mid-90s, and if we continue on with fairly unmitigated climate change, this is the temperature that my children will experience over their assumed 85-year lifespan. Now, my kids don't have kids yet, so my grandkids are hypothetical beings. But if my kids have kids when they're about 30 and those kids live till they're 85, they will live into the next century, which really brings the next century quite close. Under unmitigated climate change, my grandkids could experience global temperatures on average over their lifespan of somewhere between 3.5 and 4 degrees. That is actually what inspires me to keep going in this fight. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Bettina asks, how soon can we get Australian politicians to accept the science and to make the transition? Can I add to that question for Lesley and Richie? what do you think the timescale will realistically be for the Australian politicians and Australia to react? Lesley?
Very difficult questions, actually. Look, I think it's a misrepresentation that all Australian politicians don't accept the science. Most of them do. There are a couple of loud ones that perhaps hold more sway than they should that don't, but on the whole they do. I think what's lacking is the sense of urgency on their part. And also this notion, this false notion that of the sort of environment, i.e. climate change, versus jobs. I think what we've seen after, well, now we're still in the COVID pandemic, of course, but various groups, including my own organisation, the Climate Council, have put out basically roadmaps to green recovery. The Climate Council has done one, Beyond Zero Emissions have done one, several other organisations have done one, that show, just like the EU Green Deal, that there is great economic benefit in coming out of this pandemic and rebooting our economy in a green way. So I think that's what we've got to convince the government of. I think there are still several in the government who are beholden to the fossil fuel lobby. I think the power of that lobby is declining, but it's not declining fast enough. And one of the most disappointing things, of course, that we've seen recently is that the investment roadmap from the government is actually promoting a gas-led recovery, which, as Richie just showed, gas is a fossil fuel, and that is a very, very dangerous thing to do, to lock us into new gas infrastructure for the next few decades. So we really need to take a leaf out of the EU's book. You know, the plan that the ambassador just outlined is really exciting and is really hopeful. And if only the Australian government could have that level of ambition, we'd be doing really well.
Deborah asks, if you could do only one thing to turn climate action into mainstream activity, what would you answer?
Well, that's easy, and it does follow directly from what Richie was saying, and that's vote. If you contact your local representative, regardless of what party they are in, and you tell them that your vote at the next election, be it state or federal, will depend on the adequacy of their climate policy. Imagine if half the people in Australia actually did that. It takes an email or a phone call. And of course the follow through, we would see a lot of action very, very quickly. So absolutely your vote is what counts.
Do we have a design for buildings in Australia that is environmentally friendly?
Well, it depends, I think. I think most architects are coming through their university degrees with fantastic training in sustainable architecture. There's a lot of attention now in looking at low or zero carbon building materials like green concrete and green steel. There is tremendous interest, as the ambassador indicated, in energy efficiency. But the problem is we have a huge stock of very, very poorly built existing houses and buildings that need to be retrofitted, so which tends to be more expensive than new builds. So we've got the knowledge to do it. I remember once visiting, when I was on the Climate Commission, visiting a development in Tasmania of a developer that had built a 10-star house. And it was maybe a little bit more expensive because it was sort of new technology, but there were virtually no energy bills at all. And it was in Hobart, and it was beautifully comfortable all the year round. So we've got the science and we've got the technology. We do need the policy from governments to underpin the rolling out of that science and technology. But we certainly know how to do it. We've just got to do it.